Konnichiwa. Today we're going to talk about building a core vocabulary, which is one of the three most fundamental things in learning Japanese. Core vocabulary is that base of words that you need in order to understand a majority of what's being said in most Japanese sentences. Now, there are various approaches to this. There are core vocabulary Anki decks, which purport to give you a core 2,000 words, 6,000 words, 10,000 words. I think this is the wrong way of going about acquiring core vocabulary. Why? Two reasons. First, there is a much more efficient approach to it, which I'm going to outline in a few minutes. Second, learning this so-called core vocabulary, as soon as you take it out of the glass case of Anki and try to apply it to some real-world application like reading manga or watching anime, it tends to lead to massive disappointment. At one time, I used to look around the Japanese learning forums, and one of the commonest kinds of thread that you would see would be someone asking, how much core vocabulary do I need to learn to read manga? This poor person had very often done, say, core 6,000, and then when she comes to start trying to read a manga, she finds she has to look up every other word. And she's wondering if maybe she learned core 10,000, it would become easier. And the answer to that is it wouldn't become very much easier. Certainly nowhere near easier enough to be worth the effort of doing all that Anki work. Now, I understand why people do want to stay in Anki, because it's safe and unstressful, even if it's boring. Much less challenging than jumping into the cold water of real Japanese. But the problem is that whenever you do decide to take the plunge, it's not going to be a great deal easier from the fact that you learn so-called core vocabulary, and people are finding this all the time and being appalled by it when they suddenly see what kind of a challenge they face as soon as they leave the protected environment of Anki. Why is this? The reason is that I would say that in the sense that these people mean it, there's no such thing as core vocabulary. There is core vocabulary in the sense that there is a basis of words, perhaps 1,000 or so, that are used all the time. They're structural words, they're fundamental actions and fundamental things that we're talking about all the time, and the words that bind them together. Now, beyond this, there are other cores, but they're not a single core. What the penumbra core consists of depends entirely on what you're doing. If you're reading newspapers, you're going to have one kind of core. If you're reading science fiction, you're going to have another kind of core. If you're reading school stories, you're going to have yet another kind of core. So attempting to learn a general core is not really going to work. Saying, I've learned 6,000 core words and I still can't read this manga, is like asking, why is it so hard to knock in a nail with a rubber tire? Because it's the wrong tool for the job. So, how do we learn the core vocabulary that we actually need for doing whatever it is we want to do? And the answer is, of course, that we learn the vocabulary from what it is we want to do. So if, as I recommend, we start off immersing in Japanese by using Japanese anime with Japanese subtitles, then we take our core vocabulary from those subtitles as we watch. Now, in order to use this organic method, we need two things. We need structure and we need vocabulary. Structure you can get from my structure course on YouTube. Vocabulary you'll be getting from the anime itself, but you also need a basic vocabulary. That's what I would call a mounting block vocabulary, the mounting block that allows you to get on the horse in the first place. Enough vocabulary that you're not looking up every word. Where do you get this? Well, I'm going to assume that most of the people watching this video have it already, because you pick up this basic vocabulary at a reasonably early stage. If you don't, what I would recommend is looking at my book Alice in Kanji Land, because that will give you a few hundred words, and it will also give you basic kanji knowledge, not just a few hundred kanji, but also the free radicals, the kanji elements that aren't kanji in themselves, the way kanji is structured, the way to understand kanji and learn it. This is the basic information you need for starting this method. But whether you like my Alice approach or not, that's entirely up to you. It doesn't matter where you get this basic information from. A few hundred words will get you started. Anything up to, say, 1,000 words, provided they are really basic core words, will make it a bit easier. After 1,000, the law of diminishing returns kicks in with increasing force. The more you learn after that first 1,000, the less likely any of it is going to be to help you in whatever it is you're trying to do. Because once you've moved outside the true core of the language, the relatively small number of words that are used all the time by everybody regardless of what they're talking about, the less the chance that any of it's going to be any use to you in any given situation. Now, because everything has its own subset of core vocabulary, if you do a particular anime and stick to that series, you're going to become more and more familiar with that subset of the core. When you finally move on to another subset of the core, it's going to be much, much easier because you're going to have a lot of real core under your belt. But it's always going to be a challenge to move to another area at first. So, how do you actually go about this? I've already scratched the surface of this subject in my video about the actual techniques of using the anime method. If you're using my method, you start going through the anime, you're reading the subtitles. Anything you don't know, you look it up. If the word is important, and at this stage most words will be, but some won't, you may not want to know the word for bamboo grass, for example, you put it into your Anki, and I've explained how you can do this with a single click using Yomi-chan, which is a free utility. But the other part of this method is that you put the soundtrack of that anime, once you've gone through it, or once you've gone through a story within it, onto your iPod or your phone or whatever you're using, and you listen to it again and again and again. Sometimes you'll be listening with full attention. Sometimes you'll be listening with half attention, and sometimes it'll just be muttering at you in the background while you're concentrating on something else. But this is going to get Japanese into your blood, and in the particular matter of vocabulary, it's very important because you're going to hear those words in context over and over again, which will give you a massive advantage over somebody else who's just doing cold Anki. You'll be able to hit the easy button on those words much sooner and get them out of the way. And that's important, because Anki is, I believe, a necessary evil, but it is an evil. It's taking up time that could be used on real immersion, so we minimize it as far as possible. So the core of this approach, as far as vocabulary goes, is audio. By putting our anime or a section of anime onto our MP3 player and hearing it again and again, we are not just getting repetition, we're getting repetition of recognition, and that's the important thing. We're not just hearing the words again and again, we're recognizing them in context, seeing what they mean in themselves and what they mean in relation to other words. And with a new word, every time this happens, the brain experiences a tiny epiphany, and this is the learning process. So, what if you're one of those people, and there are quite a few of them, who find that they can't make much sense at all of the spoken word? Now, everybody has strengths and weaknesses, and if you have this problem, it's nothing to worry about. It can be overcome. But what do we do about it? The thing to do here is to cut your audio down in Audacity, the way I showed you in the first anime lesson, to a very limited amount. Depending on how much difficulty you're having, it could be just a very short sentence of 3 or 4 words. You look at the text, the subtitle, and you loop that sentence. What I would do, if you're having a lot of difficulty, is put it on a track in Audacity several times with a gap between each repetition, so you've got a few seconds to process that in your mind and work out what's going on before you hear it again. Go back to the subtitles if you need to. Once you've got this sentence hearable and understandable, you can add another sentence and another, and slowly get yourself to the point where you can understand sections of connected speech. The other approach, if you're not finding it quite so difficult, is just to listen over the soundtrack and pick out what you can, go back to the subtitles sometimes and see if it becomes clearer that way. But if you're having great difficulty, break it right down into very, very small sections at first. Now, even though audio plays a very big role in this, we are still going to need Anki. We're going to need it for kanji, and kanji are an integral part of vocabulary. You can't learn vocabulary without kanji in Japanese, whatever anybody tells you. And kanji will help you a great deal to learn Japanese more easily, especially if you use some of the hacks that I've taught for learning kanji and vocabulary in one piece. However, especially in the early stages, this leaves a number of questions. What sort of cards should we make? How should we use them? Should we have sentences on the front of the cards? Well, I would say we shouldn't, but why not? I'll explain that in the next lesson. How do we use the cards? How do we deal with kanji? And a whole range of other questions on the down-to-earth practicalities of using this organic approach to building core vocabulary. So, if you're watching this after the first week I made it, I'll put a card up on the screen so you can jump straight to part 2 of this tutorial on building core Japanese vocabulary. If you have any questions or comments on this part, please leave them in the comments below and I will answer as usual. I'd like to thank my Gold Kokeshi patrons, my producer angels who make these videos possible, and all my patrons and supporters on Patreon and everywhere. And I'd like to thank you for attending this lesson. これからもよろしくお願いします。Class dismissed.